It all began on a cold December morning when the courthouse bells tolled in a somber melody that foretold a grim verdict. In an era where trust in the justice system had long suffered from corruption and deception, Judge Malcolm Radford was a name synonymous with unwavering authority. The citizens of Eldervale looked up to him as a figure of order, but hidden behind his steely gaze and curt mannerisms lay a secret haunted by regret. It was on that fateful day that he pronounced the sentence of life imprisonment on a man named Elias Shaw, a man whose innocence few had dared to question at the time. The trial had been a whirlwind of circumstantial evidence and rushed judgments, and without the benefit of modern investigative techniques, Elias had been convicted by the weight of public opinion and flawed testimony. People whispered in hushed tones about what they later would come to know as the miscarriage of justice, though few dared to speak against the mighty Judge Radford. With a heavy heart silently burdened by the nagging thought that something was amiss, Elias was led away in shackles. The courtroom, filled with tension and despair, bore witness to the power dynamic at play between the state and the downtrodden. But as the years passed, secrets buried deep within the tangled web of Eldervale's history began to unravel, and the truth clawed its way to the surface. Elias Shaw spent a decade behind cold, unyielding bars, a decade in which his spirit was tested by isolation and relentless time. In his cramped cell, lit by the dim, flickering light of an old lamp, he would spend hours reading tattered books and scribbling notes on scraps of paper, clinging to an ever-dim hope that the truth would one day be known. The prison walls might have confined his body, but his mind remained free and mindful of every kindness, injustice, and detail that made up his life before incarceration. Though his face never made the headlines again, Elias turned into a quiet symbol of perseverance for those who dared to believe in his innocence. In his heart flourished an unyielding flame of the belief that no matter how dark the night, the dawn would eventually break. Outside those prison walls, whispers turned into roars as revelations circulated among a growing group of reformists who began questioning the fairness of the legal system in Eldervale. They argued that Elias Shaw was a victim of manipulation by powerful interests who stood to benefit from a corrupt status quo. This unanticipated dissent gradually riddled the once impregnable reputation of Judge Radford. His decisions, once deemed infallible, were now drawing increasingly severe skepticism. As the days turned to seasons, a young attorney named Veronica Hayes emerged from relative obscurity, armed with groundbreaking forensic techniques and an unyielding determination to uncover the truth. Veronica had once been a protege of Judge Radford, a bright luminary in the legal school of justice, who had admired the judge's hardline approach to law and order during her early years of practice. However, as she delved deeper into the details of Elias Shaw's case, she began noticing discrepancies that did not align with the narrative that had been painted in that fateful courtroom. The testimony of a key witness, once lauded as a piece of irrefutable evidence, now crumbled under the scrutiny of modern science. The deeper Veronica probed, the more she discovered that the trial of Elias Shaw was marred by personal vendettas and hidden motives. More than once, she encountered hushed warnings to abandon her investigations. There were forces at play that had much to lose if the truth were to come out. Yet, armed with unshakable moral clarity, Veronica persevered, viewing her mission not merely as a legal crusade but as a sacred duty to right a profound injustice. Back in the corridors of justice, Judge Radford had spent years wrestling with the consequences of his own decisions. As decades passed and society began embracing more progressive legal practices, he found himself increasingly isolated. The reverence once afforded to his name had dissipated, and whispers of guilt and regret began to tarnish his imposing reputation. Late at night, in the solitude of his study in the grand but crumbling estate he once called home, Radford would pore over old case files, each one bringing renewed sorrow for the lives inadvertently torn apart by his hand. He recalled Elias Shaw's final moments in the courtroom, the barely audible protest that had been quelled by his firm gavel, and the devastating finality of his verdict. Radford knew in the hidden recesses of his soul that in that moment, a great injustice had been done. But pride and fear once silenced him, and the years headlong passed like a relentless tide carrying his guilt to the deepest depths. Unbeknownst to him, as fate would have it, the equations of karma were slowly rebalancing themselves. The wheels of destiny had spun inexorably, guiding Elias Shaw toward a lonely journey through the darkness, toward a redemptive resurrection that would shake the foundations of the very court he once upheld. During those long, agonizing years, Elias transformed from a broken man hardened by tragedy into a being of quiet, resolute determination. The bleak isolation of prison cells nurtured a gentle and introspective side of him. He became adept at listening, absorbing every lesson that life had to impart, and developing a mindfulness that only deep suffering could yield. His cell, barren as it was, held an entire universe of dreams and recollections. He remembered the gentle rustling of autumn leaves from the park near his childhood home, the warm smile of his mother, and the playful chatter of friends he once had before circumstances scattered them like leaves in a storm. Those memories became the oasis that nourished him, keeping the despair at bay. Each day, as he observed the interplay of light and shadow on the walls of his confinement, Elias clung to the vision of a future in which justice would be real, where truth would be recognized, and where the wrong done to him would be atoned for. He gathered every scrap of hope that his mind could muster, fueling a silent revolution fueled by education, introspection, and above all, unwavering faith in the potential for change. In those quiet moments, the fire of vengeance was transformed into a burning desire to correct a flawed system and restore honor to the very principles upon which his society had been built. It was on a particularly stormy night a decade after that fateful verdict that Veronica Hayes managed to secure access to a sealed file in the state archives, a file that held incontrovertible evidence of Elias Shaw's innocence. The document, almost miraculously preserved amidst the chaos of shifting records and bureaucratic red tape, detailed the manipulation of testimonies and the planting of false evidence, a deliberate act orchestrated by a circle of influential figures whose names were hidden in layers of secrecy. This file, bearing the unmistakable imprint of modern forensic science, contained the rock-solid evidence that Elias Shaw had been framed. Armed with this newfound proof, Veronica set forth on a mission of redemption and closure. She coordinated with sympathetic legal experts and investigative journalists who recognized the gravity of the injustice. Together, they embarked on a relentless campaign to reopen the case against Elias Shaw, despite resistance from those who had long protected their interests. Their efforts were met with both acclaim and hostility, reflecting a society deeply divided between the desire for reformation and the grip of an entrenched power structure. Veronica's voice, once meek and respectful in the halls of justice, grew louder and more resolute with every public address and media interaction. She cast her words as a clarion call for transparency and accountability, hoping to awaken the latent desire for truth within a community that had grown complacent. Meanwhile, hidden in the darkest recesses of the state's bureaucratic labyrinth, Judge Radford began to experience haunting dreams that blurred the line between remorse and redemption. In each nightmare, the spectral visage of Elias Shaw would emerge, pointing a trembling finger accusingly as if to remind Radford of his failure. Those dreams, vivid and unyielding, carved deep scars into his consciousness. He knew that his entire legacy was now at stake. The very honor of his office was tainted by a single, irreversible mistake. Yet, even as he struggled internally with his past, Radford was not blind to the shifting tides of public sentiment. It became increasingly apparent that the case of Elias Shaw, once dismissed as an unfortunate aberration, had now evolved into a symbol of acclaimed reform. A surge of public outcry demanded that every unjust verdict be re-examined, and the names of those responsible for miscarriages of justice be held accountable. Names that were once hidden behind the veil of bureaucratic discretion were now being called forth into the glaring light of reform. It was not long before the political winds shifted in such a way that Judge Radford, despite his controversial past, found himself at the center of a larger metamorphosis, a transformation that would see him ascend from the depths of despair to assume the mantle of Chief Justice of Eldervale. The announcement of the new appointment came as a shock to many. The governing council, embroiled in a sweeping reform of the justice system, made the surprising decision to entrust Judge Radford with the reins of the reformed legal apparatus, believing that only someone who had intimately known the darkness of the system could now lead its reformation. With trepidation and resolve, Radford ascended to his new post with a mixture of sorrow and hope that this was an opportunity to redress the balance of justice, for himself, for Elias Shaw, and for all those who had suffered at the hands of a flawed system. Yet, as the old saying went, redemption could prove as elusive as truth itself. The new title carried with it not just power and responsibility, but also a palpable reminder of past sins. Every decision that Radford made was now under the critical gaze of a society that remembered his misstep as clearly as the scars on its collective conscience. In his inaugural speech as Chief Justice, Radford acknowledged the painful chapters of his past, expressing a genuine, contrite desire to serve the people and restore the battered trust in their legal institutions. His words, though laden with humility, resonated with those who believed in the possibility of transformation, a metamorphosis that began with a personal reckoning with one's demons. During the early days of his tenure, Radford embarked on what would become his most ambitious project yet, a comprehensive review of past convictions that had been rendered in an era of less scientific rigor and greater subjectivity. The project was fraught with political peril and bureaucratic obstacles, yet it promised at least a sliver of hope for redressing the systemic wrongs that had haunted the community for decades. Among the cases that were reopened, the file of Elias Shaw was given particular attention, and it gradually began to occupy a central place in the ongoing narrative of reformation. In the midst of all these seismic shifts, Elias Shaw's life had taken on an entirely new meaning. Upon receiving word of the evidentiary file and the unfolding movement to rectify past wrongs, he dared to climb out of the futility that had long defined his existence. His once bleak outlook was now imbued with cautious optimism, and he prepared himself for the possibility of a new beginning. The journey from despair to hope, however, was not a seamless path, and Elias met with bitter opposition from forces that had vested interests in maintaining the status quo. Rising like an unstoppable tide, the public's appetite for justice catalyzed a nationwide dialogue on the inherent fallibility of the legal system. With each passing day, the reanalysis of past cases uncovered more evidence of systematic corruption, a veritable Pandora's box of administrative misdeeds that had long been hidden from sight. Social movements, spurred on by a mixture of indignation and hope, began to demand sweeping changes that reached far beyond the figures of disgraced judges and framed convicts. In that turbulent atmosphere, Elias became more than just a symbol of one man's suffering. He transformed into the rallying cry for accountability and renewal. As his supporters gathered in public squares and chanted for justice, Elias realized that his personal redemption was now interwoven with the fate of an entire community. His story, filled with heartbreak and endurance, had become a testament to the resiliency of the human spirit in the face of relentless adversity. With the strength of conviction and the support of an ever-growing wave of reformers, Veronica Hayes took to the media to bring further attention to the ongoing judicial review. In a rare televised address that captured the attention of the nation, she recounted details from the long-forgotten case, emphasizing that each injustice corrected would mark a step closer to a fair and transparent society. Her words echoed in the hearts of many, burning away the inertia of apathy that had long permeated Eldervale's corridors of power. Political admirers of reform found themselves at an uneasy crossroads as they weighed the legacy of Judge Radford against the tide of accountability that now roared around him. In the halls of government, debates raged over the ethical implications of retaining an individual whose past was marred by grave errors. Yet, even as the critics called for his resignation, a quiet majority believed that the transformation of Judge Radford, rooted in genuine contrition and proactive reform, would not only atone for past misdeeds, but also pave the way for a more humane justice system. The months that followed were turbulent. Public demonstrations, impassioned editorials in the newspapers, and fervent debates in legislative assemblies. Radford, often seen pacing the echoing corridors of the newly renovated courthouse, wrestled with memories that refused to fade. Every creaking floorboard, every somber glance from a courthouse clerk, served as a reminder that the ghosts of past injustices were never far behind. Nonetheless, he pressed forward, knowing that his duty was greater than his personal torment. Efforts to modernize the legal system bore fruit as new technologies, including advanced forensic testing and digital records, began to replace the archaic methods of days gone by. Radford's administration was deliberate in its outreach to communities that had long felt alienated by the legal system, promising that every individual, regardless of background, would be given a fair chance at justice. Among these was an initiative aimed at reevaluating closed cases, with Elias Shaw's file serving as the catalyst for what was rapidly becoming a nationwide reckoning. As Radford pored over files and sat with battered souls in cramped conference rooms, his inner dialogue was a constant struggle with his past. There were nights when he questioned if the man who had once wielded a gavel with unerring conviction could ever escape the shadow of that one mistake. But as new proof came to light and further cases were overturned, the public slowly began to forgive, if not forget, the long-forgotten transgressions of an era that now seemed as distant as a half-remembered nightmare. Through these transformative events, a delicate reconciliation began to take form. Elias Shaw, once the unfortunate victim of a cold-handed miscarriage of justice, was eventually granted exoneration. The day the official decree was issued was marked by more than just a bureaucratic reversal. It was a moment of catharsis for an entire community. The announcement came with a solemn promise that every other wrongful conviction would be revisited with the same diligence and compassion. For Elias, however, the reinstatement of his freedom was only one facet of a more profound liberation. As he stepped out into a world that had long moved on without him, he felt the weight of lost time, yet he also felt buoyed by the possibility of renewal. With his release, Elias vowed to dedicate his remaining days to championing the cause of those who had been wronged. His journey from the depths of hopeless imprisonment to the soaring spirit of advocacy became a beacon of inspiration for all who had suffered in silence. At length, the scars of injustice began to fade, replaced by resilience, dignity, and a determination to forge a new future. The reformed justice system, championed head-on by Judge Radford and driven by the tireless efforts of reformists like Veronica Hayes, now promised that Eldervale would never again succumb to the shadows of corruption and undue influence. In the twilight of a decade filled with turmoil and transformation, the story of Elias Shaw and Judge Radford came to symbolize a broader narrative of redemption, a reminder that even the darkest missteps might pave the way for a brighter, more humane future. In the months following Elias's exoneration, the state of Eldervale experienced a renaissance of justice. Former victims of past judicial mishaps found comfort in the new era of transparency and accountability that was steadily taking hold. Community leaders began organizing town hall meetings where both the injustices of the past and the hopes for the future were openly discussed. Among these gatherings, Elias emerged as an unofficial spokesperson for those who had been marginalized by a system that had once operated behind a veil of secrecy. His soft-spoken yet firm articulation of grievance and hope resonated with individuals from all walks of life, providing a unifying voice that transcended differences of race, class, and political affiliation. These meetings, held in modest community centers and renovated civic halls, signified a communal reclamation of justice, a reclamation that did not rest solely on legal verdicts, but on the recognition of human dignity and truth. As Elias recounted his experiences in measured tones tinged with both sorrow and hope, many who had long harbored doubts about the infallibility of a closed system began to question their own complacency. He spoke of long, sleepless nights spent in a dim cell, of whispered promises to himself that he would one day see a system that truly revered the sanctity of every human life. His narrative, interwoven with the legacy of Judge Radford's own internal dilemmas, was not just one of personal redemption, but a call for collective healing and reformation. Judge Radford, now at the helm as Chief Justice, embarked on sweeping initiatives to overhaul the archaic methods that had once allowed for injustice to thrive. With a deep sense of responsibility ingrained in every decision he made, he commissioned ad hoc committees dedicated to reviewing past convictions with a critical eye. The movement quickly evolved into a full-scale reformation of the judicial process, incorporating advanced forensic methods, transparency protocols, and community engagement exercises designed to rebuild trust between the state and its citizens. Under his leadership, Eldervale began to transform its once grim and impersonal justice system into a more human, accessible body that strived to balance the scales of retribution with compassion and understanding. In public addresses, Radford repeatedly spoke of the need for an introspective examination of the powers that had long governed justice, acknowledging that in order for society to move forward, it was imperative to confront its own collective missteps. Alongside Veronica Hayes, now a celebrated figure in the realm of legal reform, Radford championed the cause of those who had long been sidelined in the corridors of power. Their partnership, forged in the crucible of reform, was emblematic of the possibilities that lay at the intersection of old wisdom and new thinking. Yet, even as reforms took root and old wounds began to mend, ghosts from the past still lurked in the shadows. Powerful figures who had once orchestrated the framing of Elias Shaw, now threatened by the unraveling of their carefully constructed facades, mounted relentless campaigns to discredit the burgeoning movement of justice. In hushed boardrooms and illicit back channels, they schemed to undermine the Reformation efforts, hoping to re-establish their long-standing influence over the legal machinery. Through smear campaigns and behind-the-scenes lobbying, these adversaries attempted to paint the newly appointed Chief Justice as a relic of a bygone era, unworthy of the honorable office he now held. Despite these tribulations, the movement for justice pressed onward, buoyed by public sentiment and the undeniable evidence of wrongful convictions brought to light by the new technological advancements and meticulous investigations. Radford, who had once presided over a distorted vision of order, now became the target of vindictive attacks aimed not only at undermining individual credibility but also at destabilizing the entire reform movement. In response, he doubled down on his commitment to transparency, inviting independent oversight of the judiciary, and even setting up a public forum where citizens could directly question the processes behind every major legal decision. This bold move, though fraught with risk, symbolized a decisive break from an old paradigm where power was concentrated and unchecked. Instead, it heralded an age where every verdict, every sentence, was now reinvented to serve the highest ideals of justice and equality. Elias Shaw, who now played an integral role on the advisory board for the reformed justice system, found solace in knowing that his ordeal was not in vain. His own transformation, from a broken prisoner to a respected advocate for justice, had struck a chord with many who once felt muted by despair. His day-to-day interactions with community members, legal luminaries, and even former opponents carried a quiet dignity that was both humbling and inspiring. In one memorable gathering held in a modest town hall, Elias recounted the arduous years of isolation and the slow, painful process of rebuilding his sense of self. His voice, at times trembling with memories of past anguish, resonated with the strength of a man who had faced darkness and emerged with a renewed vision for society. In that room, as exemplars of justice and reform sat shoulder to shoulder with those who had suffered through closures, a sense of unity blossomed, a realization that the long quest for truth was a mosaic, composed of innumerable individual stories, each adding its own hue to the grand tableau of human resilience. For Elias, that evening was not just a recognition of his personal triumph over adversity, but a celebration of the spirit of a community determined to reclaim justice in its truest form. It was a tangible demonstration that even those presumed broken by life could rebuild themselves and, in doing so, help repair the collective heart of a society that had long been scarred by neglect and injustice. Radford's own journey was replete with challenges that often seemed insurmountable. Haunted by the specters of his past decisions, he found that each step forward was tempered by the relentless vigilance of public accountability. In quiet moments, long after the clamor of political debates had faded, he would stand before a mirrored window in his office, confronting the man he once was and the formidable figure he now had to become. Those reflections, heavy with remorse and tempered by resolve, served as daily reminders that redemption was not a destination but an ongoing process, a process that required both hard introspection and the willingness to embrace change. He reached out repeatedly to Veronica, whose unwavering dedication to truth had become a beacon of light in his often tormented world. In their quiet conversations away from the public limelight, they shared fears of the past and aspirations for the future, knowing that the legacy they were crafting was one steeped in resilience, transformation, and the healing power of accountability. Their discussions, often lingering into the late hours of the night, were filled with reflections on the nature of justice itself, a concept as elusive as it was essential. For Radford, each day brought new challenges. Reformed policies clashed with entrenched biases, public hope was sometimes met by political maneuvering, and the internal struggle for self-forgiveness was as arduous as any external reform. However, through these turbulent experiences, he discovered that true leadership was defined not by the absence of mistakes, but by the courage to confront them openly and rectify them with humility and unwavering dedication. As the reformed justice system continued to make strides, the dark remnants of past corruption were slowly expunged through a series of high-profile legal battles. The conspiracies that had once conspired in shadowed corridors were exposed under the relentless inquiry of investigative teams and the unyielding scrutiny of a reawakened public. One by one, the names that had sought to manipulate fate to their own advantage were unmasked and held accountable for the damage they had inflicted on innocent lives. The network of deceit, sprawling and insidious, was laid bare for all to see. In one particularly dramatic courtroom showdown, a veteran detective presented irrefutable forensic evidence linking a cabal of corrupt officials to the deliberate framing of Elias Shaw. The revelation sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of power, and even those who had long believed in the sanctity of the established order had to confront the disturbing reality of hidden injustices. The ensuing trial, marked by an atmosphere of both righteous indignation and resolute retribution, was widely regarded as a turning point, a moment when the scales of justice, long skewed by secret agendas, began to balance in favor of truth and equity. The public, once divided by partisan loyalties and a sense of fatalism, now united in a common cause, to ensure that history would remember these events not as a descent into darkness but as the resurrection of a justice system that had learned from its past and vowed never to repeat its mistakes. With every verdict handed down in the wake of those revelations, the belief that redemption was real and attainable took firmer hold in the hearts of Eldervale citizens. In the midst of these tumultuous yet transformative times, Elias Shaw embarked on a personal journey of reconciliation with his past. He traveled to the various towns and cities that had once turned a blind eye to his plight, seeking to meet with families of those who had been affected by the very injustices he had suffered. In these unexpected reunions, the raw emotions of regret, sorrow, forgiveness, and hope intermingled. Each meeting was a delicate dance of words and silences, where the victims of past misdeeds found solace in the knowledge that one day, even seemingly irreparable wounds might begin to heal through mutual understanding. It was in a small town, under the vast expanse of a starlit sky, that Elias encountered the daughter of a man who had once testified against him, a woman who, in her eyes, now saw a kindred spirit, a symbol of perseverance amid despair. Their conversation, laden with memories of grief and the promise of new beginnings, embodied the movement for a better future, a future illuminated not by the harsh glare of retribution, but by the gentle light of forgiveness and communal progress. Elias learned that true redemption was not merely about overturning a wrongful conviction, it was about inspiring others to believe in the possibility of renewal regardless of circumstances. His warmth and sincerity, so long hidden behind the hardened mask of a survivor, shone through in every heartfelt word he spoke. Through these personal interactions, Elias's story transcended that of a single man's struggle. It wove itself into the fabric of a collective memory, a testament to the undying resilience that lay at the heart of humanity.